right, folks. Well, it's so nice to have you here. Welcome to another Apologia. If this is your first time with us, welcome. If you're a repeat offender, welcome. I'm just going to give us just a brief glimpse of how the night will go, let you know where the bathrooms and the water fountains are as well. So we'll have about 2 hours together tonight. The restrooms are very inconveniently located. The men's restroom is on that side of the lobby. The women's is on that side of the lobby. There's water fountains by either. If you do happen to lose something or misplace something tonight, that will go to the information booth, or there's a closet right by the men's restroom that's a lost and found if you've perhaps left something from previous nights as well. So how this night will go for us is we will have a number, we'll put it up now, that is for you to text in your questions. So how you can help us help you, as soon as you have a question as we go through the evening, text it in as soon as you have it. If you wait till the end of the night, there's probably a good chance we won't be able to get to it. So take a moment, take a picture of the number, make a note for yourself. It'll pop up a few more times, but just in case you miss it then, grab it right now while it's up on the screen. So just text your question in and we'll try to get that into the Q&A time in our last half. So we'll spend about an hour together with Pastor Alec and Kayleigh, and they'll just have a discussion. And after that point, we will have a 15-minute intermission. That's the great spot. Use the restroom. Check out the tables that we have in the lobby. There's a few of them. Might take you a little bit to get around. Just to highlight, we do have a book table with Kayleigh's latest book, For Such a Time as This, which I'm holding right here. We only have 200 of these, and we have way more than 200 people here. And there's also a special event price on these. They're just $17 instead of the normal, I think, close to $30. So if the content interests you, or if you already have a proclivity for reading, then I'd encourage you to grab this before we sell out, and we probably will. And then a few of the other tables we have, FPIW, the Family Policy Institute of Washington. They're familiar faces around here. I encourage you to check that table out. Turning Point USA, and Concerned Citizens for Education, which is a local school group board if you're in the kind of Edmonds, Linwood, Shoreline area and want to be a little more involved in what's going on in the schools. Great place to stop and chat. So, I should also offer that we will be selling her speaker introduction as a book as well. It's quite sizable. So, Kayleigh McEnany is the former White House press secretary, current co-host of Outnumbered on the Fox News channel. Prior to serving in the White House, Kayleigh worked as the national press secretary for the Trump campaign and was formerly the national spokesperson for the Republican National Committee. Before joining the RNC, Kayleigh worked as a political commentator at CNN. Kayleigh graduated from Harvard Law and Georgetown University School of Foreign Services with a degree in international politics. Say that 5 times fast. She also studied politics and international relationships at Oxford University. She's a recipient of the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service and the Department of Homeland Security Secretary's Public Service Award. She's the author of the New York Times bestseller book that is in my hand right now, and is in the process of authoring a second book, Serenity in the Storm, Living Through Chaos by Leaning on Christ. So would you please help me welcome our guest for this evening, Kayleigh McEnany.
Wow, this was kind of how the press corps used to welcome you, isn't it?
Jim Acosta was much less inviting and welcoming, so yes.
Well, Kayleigh, thank you. I know you have squeezed us into an incredible schedule. In fact, just before we walked out, Kayleigh was saying that she has an all-night flight tonight to get back to New York. And tomorrow morning, we'll be on the program hosting Outnumbered. So what a schedule, and we're so honored that you'd come and spend some time with us.
Well, it's an honor to be here at Westgate Chapel. It really is, and not to mention the newborn too. So he's 3 months now and doing very well.
That's awesome. So, Kayleigh, can you give us a little background in your faith journey, where your faith started, the times that we've gotten to know you on camera and the things that we've seen you in interviews? It's very obvious your faith is a vital part of your life. So talk to us about that.
Yes, it certainly is. I was blessed with two parents who loved Jesus Christ and took me to church every Sunday, encouraged me to go to youth group on Wednesdays. And it was informative growing up with that kind of background. It equipped me for the various challenges that would come in life. I remember I was a young girl and 12, 13 perhaps, walked down the aisle of my Southern Baptist church and gave my life to Christ. And I went to Catholic school for a number of years, so I also have a great appreciation for Catholicism. My husband is Catholic. But I would say my faith became real to me. I know I became a Christian on that day, but my faith became real when I left college. I left Georgetown University, I moved to Manhattan, and I went to this church called the Journey Church. And at the Journey Church, I remember the pastor saying that, you know, sometimes Manhattan, despite having millions and millions of people, can feel like the loneliest place in the world. And I certainly resonated with that feeling. And I remember one day I was feeling very lonely. I think I had gone through a bad breakup. I was trying to call my mom, whoever would answer the phone. No one was answering. I left work early. I went back to my windowless apartment, and I'm sitting there. And as I'm sitting there, I get a call. I said, first, you know, before receiving the call, I said, God, if you're real, I need to hear from you. I need to hear if you're out there. And in that moment, I get a call from an unknown number. And I answered the phone, and they said, this is the Journey Church. How can we pray for you? We feel like we need to pray for you. And at that point, my faith went from my mind to my heart, and it's been there forever. And no one could convince me otherwise, because I believe I had an experience with the risen Savior through one of his emissaries. And that faith... And that faith I took with me to the White House and beyond.
Yeah. So tell us about your educational journey and what prepared you for this time you stepped on the national scene.
Yeah, the educational background definitely helped a lot. You know, I had gone to school in D.C., so I had interned for the Bush administration, actually, and I had watched Dana Perino give a press briefing, not knowing that I would be there about 10 years later. So it was crazy. It was very surreal when I actually got the job. But Georgetown helped prepare me. But I would say what really helped prepare me was the year I spent at Oxford University. I go overseas, and they have a different academic system there. So instead of having a paper that you write, you turn it in, you get back a marking with maybe a few comments in red. At Oxford, they have this system called the tutorial system. It is excruciating in some ways. You write a 10-page paper, you read it out loud, you sit before a tutor who is a very well-credentialed academic, and she questions everything. She says, why would you say this? Defend your argument. What's your sourcing? And if you thought, you know, Jim Acosta was difficult to deal with, I could tell you, an Oxford tutor is way more difficult. My first tutorial, I walked up this 12th century spiral tower. It was a church in the middle of a graveyard that had been turned into a library, and appropriately so, because as I climbed this tower, I had no clue that waiting at the perch of this tower was a tutor who thought very differently than me. She was a former member of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. You know, I'm this Western-minded, Israel-loving, Republican conservative. She questioned me. I crumbled under pressure. I don't feel I had, you know, the correct answers. I left, and she ended up becoming one of my favorite tutors, because despite being ideologically totally different than me, she equipped me for what I would take on at the White House podium. And so I will say the educational background definitely helped a lot.
Yeah. So it actually brought you to what were the intermediary steps that got you to the White House?
So prior to going to Oxford, I had interned at Fox News. I had interned for Hannity and Combs back when Sean Hannity had a show with Alan Combs. And I'd also interned for Governor Mike Huckabee. So when I left college, I got a job as a producer for Mike Huckabee's show. And it just shows how God works. I believe he has a path for all of us if we ask him to show us that path. And to me, one of the portions of that path was working for the Mike Huckabee show as a producer. Governor Huckabee's a very talented communicator, a man of God. But as you all know, his daughter, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, was in that green room with me as a young girl, and she would come visit her dad's show. And to think that we were both sitting there, totally unbeknownst to us, that this man named Trump would run for office, become president, and we would both become his press secretaries. It's amazing, really, when you think about it. But I worked at Fox for 3 years. I left. I go to law school. Spent 1 year at Miami Law, transferred, got my degree from Harvard Law School, left there, and it was in my last year at Harvard, I had some clips from my time at Fox News, just some TV clips. I sent them to many, many producers, and the one that answered was CNN, and they called me in, and I came in, and I was this one little blonde girl on the edge of the 8-person panel being pummeled by all of those who are much further left than me, and that kind of set off a train of events that led to the White House.
Wow. Wow. So, yeah. So give us, one of the things that intrigues me as I watched you handle those press conferences was, and I don't know if anyone else thought this, but just was curious, what goes on behind the scenes? Obviously there's a great amount of preparation that you have to go through, but who are you rubbing shoulders with? What meetings are you a part of? What prepares you to have all that information, your famous black binder? What kind of preparation does that take?
So that's a great question. Press secretaries all do things differently, and you have varying amounts of access to the President of the United States. And one of the great attributes of my former boss, President Trump, is he wanted press secretaries to be in the meetings with him. And, while I wouldn't necessarily be in high-level national security meetings, if I wanted to attend a meeting or an event, he would let me do that. And it made it to where I was truly his spokesperson, not a spokesperson for myself. For example, one of the questions that caught me by surprise, and maybe you would know this if you know insider baseball of how press works, was when Jen Psaki was asked at the podium, do you have Oval Office walk-in privileges? And she equivocated on the answer and basically didn't say yes. And that's one thing that President Trump gave us, which is me, Sarah Sanders. You could walk to him, walk right past his assistant into the Oval Office. It didn't need to be scheduled, and you could quiz him on, what do you think of this policy or that policy? So when I went to the podium, there was no guessing or questioning where the president stood because I had absorbed that firsthand information. So I would say, number one, the most important part of the job was knowing what my boss thought. But number two, collecting facts and data points, which I would do by, for instance, going to the coronavirus task force meetings that would be held in the Situation Room. So you'd leave your phone at the door, you'd go in, incredibly surreal experience to sit in the Situation Room and think, this is the room in which President Obama sat when he said, yes, go get Osama bin Laden and watch the raid live, from that room. It's humbling to sit there. And we dealt with a global pandemic from that room. Vice President led a lot of those meetings, and I was a vigorous, note-taker, absorber of information, and I'd try to get all of the facts from there, glean them, go to my office, and I would call secretaries from departments or call the head of Homeland Security, whomever that was related to the topic, and quiz them on the subject matter. So when I walked to the podium, I had that information. I had an incredible staff. We'd sit around a wood-burning fireplace in my office, and we would sit there, two staffers in particular, Julia and Chad, and for hours and hours and hours, we would go through every potential question that could possibly be asked. And oftentimes, we would identify the hardest possible question. We knew that this would be so difficult to answer, but they never asked that question because the press didn't really do their homework. But we always knew the hardest one.
So what's it like carrying your faith into that kind of an environment?
I don't know how you can sustain in a job like that without it. I really don't. Because I talk about this human level of preparation that would go on. Very important. You have to know your facts. You have to have a good binder together. That was interesting. One quick note on the binder. The press actually had a camera behind me, and they could take pictures of my binder. And CNN would have an article decoding the tabs of Kayleigh McEnany's briefing binder. Like, they'd try to figure out what each tab meant. And we thought one day we'd do a head fake, and instead of like COVID or vaccine, we'd do Jim Acosta, Caitlin Collins, like their names to keep them checked. But we did not do that. But You know, I will say, as important as that human preparation was, the faith was so much more important. Before my first press briefing, I listened to Christian music. I tweeted out Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I listened to a Joyce Meyer sermon about faith over fear. So I did all of this, and I go into the White House for the first briefing, May 1st, 2020, thinking I'm ready. As I'm sitting there, I'm getting incoming from a lot of people, Christians around the country who had been praying for me. Sarah Sanders reached out to me, and she gave me a list of advice and said, most importantly, pray. And she sent me her Jesus Calling devotional from exactly 2 years prior. She would read it every time before she'd walk to the podium. And so she sent me her Jesus Calling devotional from 2 years prior, and it basically said not to worry. But I worried a lot that day. You know, I'm a human. It's my first press briefing. And my assistant comes in and says, you know, let's get your parents on the phone and say a prayer together, and we did. And then I went to the private dining room. It's off the Oval Office, and the president was there, Mark Meadows was there, Vice President Pence was there, and he motioned towards me with praying hands. And then I went to the private bathroom in the West Wing, got on my knees and said a prayer. And I went from jittery, nervous, worried to standing at the podium and having a total and complete serenity that only was made possible through Christ and through the millions of people across this country who prayed not just for me, but for the administration. So I want to thank you, because when you prayed, we felt it. And standing at the podium, I was a testament to that because I felt so at peace. So thank you, all of you who prayed for us.
I've not been an avid follower of politics until about maybe 4 or 5 years ago. But it certainly seems to me that in the administrations that my wife and I have watched down through the years, it seems to me that if there are Christians in different administrations, even conservative administrations, there are few and far between, and there maybe are just given lip service. But it seemed to me when just getting ready for tonight, when you think of Mike Pompeo, and the Bible that was always open on his office desk, Dr. Ben Carson, and his outright faith and very outspoken faith, Betsy DeVos, and I'm sure there are others that had deep faith that I wasn't even aware of. It seems to have been a cabinet and administration that did more than just give lip service to evangelical Christianity.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. A great spiritual leader in the White House was the Vice President, Mike Pence. When you talk about faith and living out authentically, he certainly did. There were many times in the hallway where he would stop me and say, oh, I saw that Christian lyric that you tweeted out. I love that. Go check out this Christian artist. His team led a Bible study. There were so many Christians in the White House, just colleagues that I worked with, friends of mine. It was a place that had a lot of prayer going on throughout the day, even if it's just a silent little prayer in between going from point A to B. You know, my team, my press team, we started a tradition to add on to Sarah's, reading the Jesus Calling devotional. We added on to that saying a prayer together as a team. It's the last thing before we did each time we walked to the podium. We'd stand in a circle. There was a guy named Ben Williamson. He worked for Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, who, by the way, was also a very, very strong Christian man, is a strong Christian man. And Ben Williamson from his office would come. We started calling him Pastor Ben. He was not a pastor, but he'd always lead us in prayer, and then we'd walk to the podium. So from the chief of staff to the vice president, there were Christians all throughout the administration.
How did that come about, do you think? Was that intentional?
I think, you know, the president surrounded himself with some very good people. And I think he was attracted to men and women who had this kind of authenticity about them. And sure, were there some, you know, hires in the White House that didn't pan out so well? Sure. But, you know, he hired a lot of really good people, and he often doesn't get enough credit for that. I'd like to think I'm one of them, Sarah Sanders, Chief of Staff Meadows, among others.
Yeah. One of the things that we get as incoming here quite a bit, since Westgate's taken a little more of a stand on these issues, is that we're simply shills for the Republican Party, and that they are purely using evangelical Christians and the concerns that evangelical Christians carry as a tool to get the evangelical vote, but they absolutely have no basic interest in the things that interest evangelical Christians. How do you feel about that?
I think it's a baseless criticism. When you look at, for instance, my former boss, he promised to appoint pro-life justices, and what did he do? He did that. He could have walked away and said, no, I'm going to appoint someone who's more middle of the road, but he chose justices that showed absolute, total, and complete fidelity to the law, so much so that Roe v. Wade was overturned via the Dobbs decision. It was the single most consequential act, I think, of the Trump administration. In fact, I was reading on my way here that Texas believes that since they passed their pro-life legislation, that 50,000 lives have been saved, and that's just in the state of Texas. And I would just add on religious liberty, President Trump, the justices he appointed, you can look very clearly at the way the Supreme Court was deciding on COVID as with regard to churches, and all the decisions were going in one way. COVID really exposed who was a despot among our governors, and Gavin Newsom was one of the worst offenders. I was just learning a little bit about Governor Inslee and what he was doing here. But the way the laws were applied so differently between places of worship and just secular actors. And, Gorsuch, writing in dissent on a lot of these cases, because churches were losing all across California, said, why are you allowed to go to every other type of place? I believe it was Kavanaugh who said you can go to a marijuana dispensary but not a church. How does that make sense? It doesn't. But then all of a sudden, Amy Coney Barrett gets appointed to the court. I was there for the confirmation ceremony. All of the decisions start going another way. And California was rebuked not 1, 2, 3, 4, but 5 times. The most recent of which was Tandem v. Newsom, where Governor Newsom was trying to regulate the number of people who can gather in a home for private prayer. It's extraordinary. So a long answer to your question is, when you look at the quality of justices that were appointed and the way those decisions are coming down, that fidelity to the Christian movement is there, and it's real.
Yeah. I don't know that you would necessarily have the answer for this, but it's curious to me how universally the name Donald Trump seems to bring vitriol out. Really, even in many Christian circles, it's like, can you think? Can you think why? I know his tweets were mean. I realize that, and this is not a Donald Trump campaign speech, but I know his tweets were mean, and I know he can be very forthright and direct, but there seems to be an uncharacteristic reaction to him across the board. Any thoughts about why?
I think, he was the first Republican president in a long time that chose to fight back. And when I say fight back against this really kind of cabal between social media and corporations and liberal media that make the narrative all go in one direction. Now, do I agree with everything President Trump ever tweeted? No, certainly not. I would have said things differently in places. But what I realized, because I initially supported Ben Carson in 2016, loved Ben Carson, was a big fan of his and an advocate. And then I realized when I was on Harvard Law School's campus just how insane it was to see liberal narratives totally take control of the student body, where you couldn't even as a conservative speak without backlash. You just couldn't. So most people stayed silent. And if you didn't stay silent, there would be consequences. In some places, perhaps grades, not at Harvard. That wasn't necessarily the professors doing the suppression, but certainly backlash from your peers. And it was in that environment that I realized we need a fighter. We need someone who's going to fight back. And can President Trump be indelicate at times? Absolutely. There are tweets I didn't like. But that being said, he fought back in a way that was so powerful, so important, to the point where now, for instance, 67% of people polled by Edelman Trust Barometer believe the media is actively making things up to support an agenda. That's happening. And let me say,
You have your briefing notes right there.
I don't, but just one example, because it's so eye-opening. I don't just want to speak about this, kind of cabal, if you will, of those entities in theory. Let me tell you what I mean in practice. So Stacey Abrams, if you remember, the twice failed gubernatorial candidate for the Democrats down in Georgia, she made this statement: there's no such thing, speaking of life, there's no such thing as a heartbeat at 6 weeks. It is a manufactured sound designed to convince people that men have the right to take control of a woman's body. Now, I went to an ultrasound at 5 weeks. I saw the heartbeat on an ultrasound. I heard it. And this was not a group of medical specialists trying to convince me that my husband sitting next to me controlled my body. No, that didn't happen. This is what we like to call science. And in fact, March of Dimes confirms there's a heartbeat at 6 weeks. National Library of Medicine, Mayo Clinic, National Health Service. But what happened? Stacey Abrams made this comment, and what happens? Well, around the same time, it might have been slightly before, Planned Parenthood changed their website to say that there isn't a heartbeat. We'd expect that from Planned Parenthood, but here's what you may not expect. On Twitter, this was pre-Elon Musk takeover, they have a trending section. So it lists out everyone, whoever's the most talked about person or subject matter. Stacey Abrams was trending. And underneath, there's supposed to be an agnostic, kind of neutral description for why the person's trending. Well, here's what Twitter said about Stacey Abrams as to why she was trending. GA gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams said there is no such thing as a fetal heartbeat at 6 weeks of pregnancy, and doctors agree one does not exist during this early stage of pregnancy. Reports from NBC News and NPR confirm. So, isn't that interesting? Here you have social media changing the science, along with the liberal media changing the science, and apparently doctors as well, according to that description. So I tell you that to say, it is real, that there is a left-wing corruption in many of our institutions. And my former boss, for taking all of his flaws, fought back in a way that I think was a neck good and exposed a lot of that.
Yeah. Do you see any strong Christians on the scene right now in D.C. that give you some degree of hope?
I do, and one of those is Senator Tim Scott. He's fantastic. I love him. If you want to learn a little bit about him, his story, and his faith, Sarah Sanders gave an incredible State of the Union rebuttal this year, probably the best I've seen. But right there, I say probably the best I've seen, because right there in line with it, and it didn't get that much attention, but it should have, President Biden gave his joint address to Congress. That's what is in lieu of a State of the Union, the first year of a presidency. Tim Scott gave the response, and what a remarkable man. He talked about redemption and having hope in this country, and how despite the bitterness we see back and forth between the two parties, that we can have a national healing. And it's all centered around faith and getting back to having faith in our politics. So Tim Scott, I think, is one of the bright ones when it comes to faith. You name most of the great ones, Pompeo and Ben Carson, among others, but Tim Scott is a name that comes to mind.
Awesome. Thank you. So what would you say the State of the Union is right now?
Man. First, I would say fractured. We have a president who gave an inauguration speech, and he mentioned unity about a half a dozen times. And he said, unity seems elusive, but we can have unity. And it seemed like an olive branch. He wanted to heal the country, if you believed what he was saying. But since then, he gives a speech on vaccines and says the vaccinated have a right to be angry. He used the word angry at the unvaccinated. He went to Georgia, and Georgia's election integrity law, which just put in place basic safeguards for our elections. He said if you supported that law, you were a segregationist, and he named names. And in fact, Georgia, their voting increased. More people were enfranchised in Georgia. And then he gave the speech that is hard to forget in front of the blood red background, where he called MAGA Republicans not just extremists, but he said a clear and present danger. I mean, this is not rhetoric that is uniting, and I think has gone a long way in fracturing our country. So I would say fracture number one. And the second I would use is the state of our union is compromised. You see what's happening at the southern border. You see what's happening with the Hunter Biden investigation. You see what's happening. We're weaker on the world stage than ever before, with China flying a spy balloon across the entirety of the United States, Russia invading Ukraine. It really feels as a country that we are compromised, and our national security has never been more compromised. So those are the two words I would say.
Yeah. You speak in your book about taking time to listen to the other side. Is there much common ground for that?
I mean, no, but in all reality, you know, there are very good people on the other side of the aisle. For instance, one who comes to mind is Van Jones. He's a CNN commentator. He's very liberal, worked for Obama. But I will say something that united us above our parties was our faith. One of my first days at CNN, I knew I was about to go on this 8-person panel and just be skewered, and I rounded the corner for the green room, and that's where you wait before you go on air. And he was sitting there. He'd never met me, and before he even said, "Hi, my name is Van Jones," the first words he said to me were, "I love your cross." And I loved that. It meant a lot to me, and he's shown himself to be a person of faith, despite the fact that I think his politics are crazy. But when we put Christ above party, which it should always be, Christ should always come first, some remarkable things can happen. And we saw that with criminal justice reform, where when no criminal justice reform organization would partner with the administration on the First Step Act, which let nonviolent offenders have reduced sentences, not like some of the crazy crime laws you're seeing now. It was a very well thought out law, very common sense changes. Not a single civil rights group would partner with Trump. Why? Because of his name. Despite the fact that they supported the cause, they wouldn't partner with him. But Van Jones stepped forward and said, "I'll partner with President Trump," and achieved a lot of good, to the point where I went to a rally in Michigan. This is when I was on the campaign, and a young man came up to me with tears in his eyes, and he said, "I made a really dumb decision when I was a young kid. It was a nonviolent offense. They threw the book at me, but thanks to your boss, to President Trump, I'm out and I get to be with my family this Christmas." And he was an amazing young man. So it just shows where, when we can try to, in a calm way, share our viewpoint with the other side of the aisle, there is room, perhaps slight room in the middle for some sort of change.
Yeah. Well, what do you feel from your perspective it's going to take to change the political landscape?
Yeah, you know, I think we need a heart revival in this country. And look, because we have a country that's perilously going in the wrong direction. And I write about this. I have a new book coming out called Serenity in the Storm, Living Through Chaos by Leaning on Christ. And what I really wanted to do is suggest that, you know, we have a politics problem, yes, but more than that, we have a cultural problem where good is evil and evil is good, and there's no clear delineation between right and wrong, and there must be. We know that as Christians. We know the kind of chaos that ensues when you take away those safeguards that Scripture puts in place. So we need to have a cultural revival where we return to a place where we don't have parental secrecy policies. I can't believe that, you know, statewide in New Jersey, a parental secrecy policy, and many states are like this, where your child goes to school, decides they want to change their name and their pronoun, and parents don't learn of this. It's unreal. And you think it's just happening in California, where there is a lawsuit going on to that effect, but it's also happening in my home state of Florida. In North Florida, a young girl decided to change her pronoun. And what happened? Well, her parents were kept in the dark. And you know when they were informed? When their daughter tried to commit suicide in the bathroom. That's when the parents found out. You know, you see this in education. You see this on the issue of life. People who want abortion until birth, that's still something that the left, some on the left, advocate for. Fully formed human beings capable of feeling pain. We have to get back to a place where our young people are going to church, profess belief in Christ, and it will reshape our politics. And I'm encouraged by the Asbury revival that we saw. There's such a yearning in the human heart, especially among young girls. You know, the CDC data came out that showed 1 in 3 girls were considering suicide. 1 in 3. You go on social media, it's so toxic, it's so dark. It puts an unreasonable expectation on our young people. And then you see how fentanyl's taken hold, and people, young kids who make one mistake and order a prescription drug or what they think it is a prescription drug illicitly, and it turns out to be fentanyl. If we put Christ in the human hearts of these young people, I don't think you'd see 1 in 3 girls wanting to commit suicide. So we need to bring our young people back to Christ, and it will change our politics.
Just while we're on the subject, in the county of Snohomish, right now, the leading cause of death in 10 to 17-year-olds is suicide in the county. And yet, our legislators right now in Olympia are working hard to make the assisted suicide laws even less restricted, make it easier to commit suicide in the state. So if you think of it, and this is just a perfect segue just quickly, when you're done, stop at the FPIW table in the back, because they actually have some action plans for you to talk to the senators, state senators, before tomorrow morning, because it actually goes to vote tomorrow morning. So there's some things that you could do, and we could flood that exchange, blow up the phone exchange right now if we left here and did something about what's on the docket for tomorrow morning. So stop at the table on your way out, would you, and see what you can be a part of with that. Do you feel like there is any kind of political awakening happening right now, that the darkness we've walked through since 2020, and it didn't start in 2020, it's been encroaching for a long time, but the darkness that we're all experiencing, and the nation, the chaos in the nation, is there any kind of political stirring on the right or the left that gives you some hope that there are people that are saying, we got to do something about that?
I think so, and I think you saw that in Virginia in the election of Glenn Youngkin. Education was the #1 issue in that election. You had a group of voters who just said, hey, enough is enough. The fact that they're going to school board meetings, you saw the passion on those parents' faces, and you saw the way that election turned out. Look, just recently, this week, President Biden has woken up to realize, well, maybe, someone's told him that he has an election coming up, he's kind of snapped into shape, because just this week, DC, despite having carjackings up 111%, DC decided we're going to lessen the penalty for carjacking. And our federal government technically is able to control DC's laws because it's not a state, it's a district. And so what President Biden had said is he said he was going to veto a Republican resolution that would have repealed that really dumb decision to lessen carjacking penalties. He said, I'm going to veto it. He reversed course, and he said, now I'm going to stand with the Republicans on this. Now, that's purely politics. He knows an election is coming up, but it's indicative of the realization that his party is not making the correct decisions on crime. Education, I think you're going to see Democrats trying to kind of temper their views and distance themselves from what we know is happening in our jurisdictions across the country, which is taking parents out of it and allowing the teacher to become the parent. So I think there is a political awakening, but it's manifesting that in an election with good candidates and changing political leadership, because the midterms were disappointing. They just were.
Yeah. Before we talk about 2024, could you comment about what appears to be a rogue DOJ and the FBI? Are you free to talk about what's going on, where it seems to be a two-tiered form of justice?
Yeah, no doubt about it. I brought these numbers. Tucker Carlson did a phenomenal monologue, I believe it was last week, on the DOJ and the way that Christians are being targeted. And he played a clip from Senator Mike Lee, and these numbers are astonishing. So 34 individuals have been charged with blocking access to abortion facilities, 34. So these are pro-lifers. There have been 81 attacks on pro-life facilities, 130 attacks on Catholic churches, and yet just 2 charges for the perpetrators of those activities. So you have 34 charges for blocking access, 2 charges for the vandalism we've seen, despite the vandalism being much greater. You've seen cases like Mark Hook, who was a father, I believe a father of 7. He was one of the people charged. All he did at this abortion facility is an individual came up and started verbally attacking his son, and he intervened to get the individual away from his son. There were no charges pressed locally, but the DOJ decides to not just charge him, but show up at his house with armed FBI agents in the middle of the night in front of his children. It's absolutely insane. So you see the pro-life community being targeted. You see there was a memo that went out, an FBI memo, targeting radical traditional Catholics as national security threats. I went to Catholic school my whole life. Every other week I go to Catholic Mass with my husband, and then we'll go to my non-denominational church. I can tell you, I've never encountered a radical traditional Catholic. And apparently all these people want is Latin Mass back, but they're a national security threat. So there's just simply no doubt that the DOJ is being used in a very politicized manner. And unfortunately, the chief target is the pro-life community, which is sad to see. But the wheels of justice are working because some of those charges have been dropped by courts.
Yeah. Do you see, can you speculate on what the answer may be to correct that in future generations or future administrations?
Yeah, a new president. I mean, that's the only answer.
Really is frightening for just ordinary people like us to watch what's going on and realize how very easily we could be the target. Yeah. You know, that Merrick Garland could send a letter about us, and suddenly we find ourselves having to, sell our houses to pay for legal bills. It's a frightening prospect.
It's extraordinary. It really and truly is. I think it was, I listened to a talk by a Supreme Court justice, and he said, every person in this room has done something that I could use the vast criminal code to target. And when you see a DOJ that chooses, pro-life community, you're the one I'm targeting, you can see the way these laws are twisted and manipulated. Literally, Christians just praying in front of abortion facilities, just praying, have been charged. No harassment, no violence, simply sitting there in prayer.
Yeah. God help us. Looking ahead to 2024, what do you expect the political arena to look like, and what role will conservatives play?
An important one. The arena is going to be vast. I don't think it'll be quite as big as the crowd in 2016, but so far, you've got 3 who have declared, Trump, Nikki Haley, and Ramaswamy, but there are going to be many more. I fully expect, I'm just guessing here, Pompeo to declare. I have many others. There's a long list. I think it's like 16 or something, maybe Kristi Noem, who knows. But there will be many, many others. Perhaps Tim Scott, DeSantis, of course, likely will throw his hat in. And conservatives, we have a very important role because, to me, when you look at the field, and I think it's important to have a primary and to have that internal party debate, hopefully in a respectful way, about what we want our candidate to look like. And, for me, there's 3 criteria as conservatives. Number 1, be a conservative, not just in word, but in action. A conservative who understands what's at stake. Number 2, we need a fighter. And we're fortunate as a party to have quite a few. Not only my former boss, my Governor DeSantis has shown himself to be a worthy fighter who's willing to fight with the press. And when I say fight, I don't mean physically, I mean intellectually. So number 2, a fighter. And number 3, someone who can win a general election. We've got to win a general election in this country. And, I leave it to the conservative movement to decide who that candidate's going to be. But those are the 3 criteria, and we have a very important decision as conservatives to look at that debate stage and decide who it is we want to put forward.
So I want you to wear your legal hat for a moment for us. We've got a House bill here in Washington, HB 1333, that would label anyone who disagrees with Olympia. Does anybody disagree with Olympia? I probably shouldn't say this, but I got into big trouble here a while ago because I was in a board meeting and called Inslee a snake. This is during COVID. And I got into, not with most of the board, but I got into big trouble calling him a snake. And I thought, Jesus called Herod a fox. And that, I know I'm not Jesus, but that was not an endearing term back then. So House Bill 1333 labels anyone who disagrees with Olympia a terrorist. What do you think of the chances of that? It's already cleared the first reading in the House committee hearings in Olympia. What do you think of its legal chances?
You know, I think it depends. There's a clear indicator to me that this is intended to be applied in ways to punish political enemies. And the reason I suggest that is, so there's going to be this 13-member commission, right, who's going to list out who's a domestic violent extremist. And according to Washington Policy Center Director, here's what she said, that it would criminalize certain forms of expression based on what members of a state commission consider to be their definition of domestic extremism. Creating a state-level ministry of truth would not only undermine democratic norms, it would have a chilling effect on public debate, freedom of speech, and civic participation. She's right, because apparently this domestic violent extremism label would be applied to non-criminal individuals. So that would be suggestive of punishing speech or just punishing something outside of criminal provisions. And if it's applied in that fashion, I mean, that's very clear First Amendment suppression of lawful political speech, which would be unconstitutional. So should this pass and be applied in that fashion, I would fully expect to see a challenge that could even make its way to the Supreme Court, perhaps.
Yeah, wow. So this last election, we all held our breath in the hopes that, you know, there were all kinds of promises of a red wave. And again, can I just say, I know many of you perhaps don't know me, but we're doing these Sunday night apologias as a mechanism to awaken the Christians in the Pacific Northwest to the truth of the issues and the seriousness of the issues. And these are largely biblical issues. Most of the things that we address in these apologia sessions are biblical issues. Our fundamental belief here, and I know you haven't come to hear me, so I'll try and make this fast. Our fundamental belief here at Westgate is that, like Kayleigh said a minute ago, the only hope we have in this country is not going to be found in either political party or the White House. The only real hope we have is a visitation of God on the Church of Jesus Christ to awaken. To awaken, you know, when there was a revival, the first great awakening in the UK, that's where prison reforms came from. That's where the abolition of child labor came from. That's where abolition of slavery came from. That's why building hospitals for the poor, all the things that the society so desperately needed came out of the first great awakening. Now, I'm not saying we sit around, I'm not saying we sit around and wait for that awakening, but absolutely, our primary goal is to see God glorified in his church once again, right? But while we do that, we've got some battles to fight, and it really is time for us to be engaged. And we need, as Christians, we need to roll up our sleeves, make our voices count, and do whatever we can. You know, please forgive me, Kayleigh, for a second. Brad Payne runs the policy wing of FPIW, and he called me the other day because they do their best to try to encourage Christian politicians in Olympia to speak up for biblical issues. But they say when they finally do and muster the courage to go to the microphone, they look in the gallery or they look around and see, are there any pastors here standing with me? And they can't find a pastor in the place. And I said to Brad, that's wrong. That's wrong. That place needs to be full of pastors speaking to the truth that God has put in our hearts. All right, enough of that.
God bless Westgate for doing that.
Yeah. So what happened with the hopes we had that we'd see conservative candidates win in the last election?
Yeah, I was hopeful, and I learned very clearly, don't look at polling. I mean, the polling was, in many ways, as Rush would say, designed to shape public opinion, not gauge it. And I think we saw that because the polling was very wrong this election. We still took back, and I say we, me being a Republican, took back the House of Representatives, which is good, of course. But we expected to have a much more vast victory, winning it by a greater margin, perhaps retaking the Senate, and we didn't see that. I think three things happened. Number one, I would say the early vote. The early vote, for instance, in I think it was Pennsylvania, you could early vote, I think, for 50 days. 50 days. So we saw this happen with COVID-19, right? Democrats expanded early voting, and they have an operation where they can go and get people out, get early votes. In some states, ballot harvesting is legal, and Republicans are simply behind on this. We rely on in-person voting, and someone gets sick, something happens with your child. I would always show up, of course, but a lot of people won't if something happens or goes wrong. So we can't rely on day of voting. Republicans have to get a better early vote operation. DeSantis, for example, had a great early vote operation, and you see what a victory he had. So that's a mechanical point. But number two, I would say, we prematurely were talking about 2024 before 2022. I love my former boss. He's great. I have great affection for him. But there's a lot of talk about him getting in the race and how the 2024 election would play out. And when we get ahead of our skis on that, it allowed us to nationalize an election that should have been about individual races, individual states, and individual candidates. And for instance, you saw Kemp outperform Herschel Walker, who lost. There was this gap between the two Republican candidates in the state. You saw Lombardo win in Nevada, but Laxalt lose. So you saw this differential, and I think it put a lot of pressure on the candidates when we started talking about 2024 ahead of 22. And finally, I would say, a lot of people say, oh, abortion, that's the reason. I disagree. I think, sure, it might have motivated some people in some places. But as Vice President Pence said, that this issue, to quote him exactly, the issue of life is profoundly more important than short-term politics. And he's right about that. So for those who say, oh, it's abortion, I don't think that was the main reason. And I do know that a lot of lives have been saved. 63 million children died at the scourge of abortion since Roe was passed. So if I'm going to stand on an issue, I'm going to narrowly win the House of Representatives and save the 63 million future lives that were at stake because of Roe v. Wade.
So you spent most of your time in the national eye as press secretary. Tell us your read on the role that mainstream media plays and has played in shaping the nation.
Yeah, it's been quite something, and I have some examples for you, and these are just a few, because the thing that happens is, these issues are discussed for a time period. I mean, you all watch cable news cycles, so there's an issue that will be discussed, and then it goes away, and people move on, and they go to the next issue. And there's very little retrospective analysis of how right and wrong the media was on certain things. Now, I do this because, I stood at the podium and I had to talk about a lot of these issues, and it's interesting for me and my team to retrospectively see how some of their headlines panned out. But let me give you just three examples of what I mean. So when I stood at the podium, there was an issue. Lafayette Square is what we call it. And this was amid all the riots that were happening at the time over the summer. And NPR had this headline, and it's emblematic of what the mainstream media narrative was. Peaceful protesters were tear-gassed to clear the way for Trump to have a photo op at Lafayette Square. That was the allegation. I was asked about this from the podium ad nauseum for many press briefings. Washington Post said inside the push to tear-gas protesters ahead of Trump's photo op. They even said from Tiananmen Square to Lafayette Square. Jim Acosta said if the White House could do it over, would you have gassed and pummeled protesters to clear the park so the president could have a photo op? Well, leave office many months later, Biden's Inspector General at his Department of Interior said this: we determined that the evidence did not support a finding that the U.S. Park Police cleared the park so that the president could enter the park. So false. All those headlines, wrong, incorrect. They didn't listen to what I was saying from the podium. They ran with the headlines. They were all false, as reflected by the Department of Interior Inspector General. Another example, the Russia bounty story. I will never forget this one. So the New York Times, they said that there was intelligence showing that Russia was placing bounties on the heads of American troops in Afghanistan. Press runs with the narrative. I said, this is not verified. There's no consensus on this intelligence. In fact, there are dissenting views on it. But here's what happened. Biden accused Trump of dereliction of duty. Ironic in hindsight, given what happened in Afghanistan. Donald Trump was accused of treason. And in fact, the New York Times, and this is the sickest part to me, went to Gold Star families, mothers and fathers of people who lost their child abroad, doing heroic things, and convinced them that there were bounties on the heads of U.S. troops and that they had a commander-in-chief who did nothing about it, and they solicited quotes from them. Well, here's how that turned out. Daily Beast, not a right-wing publication at all. Here's what they said. Again, 10 months later, everyone's forgotten about the story. U.S. intelligence walks back claim that Russia put bounties on American troops. This is Biden's intelligence community, walked back the claim. It was a huge election time story that prompted cries of treason, but according to a newly disclosed assessment, Donald Trump might have been right to call it a hoax. I could list off for you other stories. The COVID lab leak theory. Washington Post went so far as to say it was debunked. It was debunked, all because Trump said it. And now you see what's happened just this week. The Department of Energy has changed their assessment to say it was likely a lab leak. But because the president said it, the press decided to pummel it as a false claim. So my point is, the media goes a long way in shaping public opinion. All of these stories happen, and if you believe them, then you believed at the time that Trump was a derelict commander-in-chief who was peddling COVID lab leak conspiracy theories, which now apparently were true. But that's the power of the press, and for 10 months later, it to be debunked by Biden's intelligence community, his Department of Energy. No one reports the debunking. On Fox we do, but where are the firings in newsrooms? Where are the retracted headlines? They don't exist because there's no accountability with the press.
Wow. Yeah. Should we talk about Hunter Biden's laptop?
Another one. Yes, that was Russian disinformation. Didn't you hear that, Pastor?
Yeah, I did. And I believed it. Not really. Do you believe the First Amendment is under attack?
Definitely. I had a Twitter account, my personal one, so not my White House one. And so on your personal Twitter account, you're allowed to tweet things like Hunter Biden laptop. It was kind of election related, so I put it on my personal account rather than my government one. But nevertheless, you had Twitter, who not only banned the New York Post, one of the largest newspapers in the entire country. I believe it's the oldest continually running newspaper in the country, founded by Alexander Hamilton. They banned the New York Post, and then they banned my account simply for sharing the story. And think about that. You have a press secretary who, yes, it was my personal account, not a government account, but you get banned weeks before an election simply because you bring up a story that now we all know is true. We know that laptop's been verified. The New York Times has verified it at this point. But you get banned, the First Amendment speech taken away, all because the speech that you were putting forward is politically unpalatable to the left who run social media. So there's no doubt the First Amendment's under attack. I mean, that's just one small example. But there's simply no doubt. You see what happened with COVID here and elsewhere, the way First Amendment freedom of religion was suppressed, and the freedom to speak with your church in unison simply because of a global pandemic.
Yeah. It's pretty incredible to watch all these things unfold. Were you surprised when all the revelations started coming out of the Twitter emails and Twitter files after Elon Musk? Were you surprised that there wasn't national outcry over the revelations associated with those?
Yeah, I wasn't surprised because it's expected from the media. But I mean, how shocking that, you literally have the government sending what they consider to be disinformation to private actors, to social media, to Twitter at the time, and Twitter acting in lockstep. with a political campaign in many cases. So I wasn't surprised by the lack of coverage. I wasn't surprised by the contents of the Twitter files, but God bless Elon Musk for exposing it. What a national treasure.
Well, we've come up, believe it or not, on our break. This is an opportunity for you to access the tables we have in the back. Please follow up on FPIW and what they're doing right now about the assisted suicide bill, and take advantage of that. Use the restrooms, and we'll be back shortly after the break. God bless you.
I'll give you a quick second to settle back in before we launch into our Q&A time together. A few real quick announcements as you're finding your seats. First of all, if you would like to stay connected to Apologias, like to have a sense ahead of time who's coming when, at what time, there's a real easy way you can stay connected. We've got a quick slide here to give you some of the details, but you can get on our email list. We don't sell your email to anybody, and we won't fill your inbox with 3 emails a day, promise. You'll just get a simple email every once in a while just saying, hey, here are the next upcoming Apologias, so you can stay up to speed, so you can get it on your calendar. Also, Apologia by design from the very beginning, we have intended it to be open to the public, no paywall at the door, no need to get tickets for, because we really just value the space to be able to have these conversations, and we want to have as few barriers for people to that as possible. Also, as you could imagine, the expense required to bring in speakers of this caliber is high. And Apologia really does run on donations. It kind of operates outside of our church budget. So if you have benefited from Apologias in the past or in benefiting tonight, if I could just ask for your support as we continue Apologia. We'll see in a moment our next one. We have Dennis Prager coming in May, I believe. So if you can just help us to continue bringing guests of this caliber, it's greatly appreciated. So that said, let's watch this quick video about Dennis Prager joining us for the next Apologia.
Whenever I summarize my life's work, there has been one overwhelming theme: the consequences of secularism. The general modern belief is you can be too religious, but you can't be too secular. But it's not true. If society gets too secular, it ends. We become stupid as we depart from that book that people laugh at called the Bible. And this is all a function of the secular world in which we live. The West was formed by Christianity. And again, I'm a Jew telling you this. I have no axe to grind here. My axe to grind is what is true.
Okay, looks like we're just about all back. As Pastor Alec and Kayleigh come back, just one final thing. We only have about 20 of her books left. So if you do want one, and that is a 5-minute-old statistic, they could be all gone. So at the end, just make your apologies. You can enlist the help of your whole row. And just they can block lanes of pedestrian traffic for you to get to the book table. So all that said, would you join me in welcoming Pastor Alec and Kayleigh back out?
Well, as usual, you sent a whole bunch of awesome questions in, and I don't know that we'll get to all of them, but we'll try. Kayleigh, given your experience and time in the White House, if given the opportunity, would you serve in a future administration?
Well, thank you, whoever sent that, for your vote of confidence. You know, I hate to sound like politician-y because I'm pretty forthright with what I think, but I'd have to see where life is. It's a demanding job. I will say I had so much fun doing that job. It might not have looked like it, but I truly enjoyed being at the podium. It is the opportunity of a lifetime. You're a part of history, so it's a hard job to ever say no to. But it's really wonderful where I am currently. I love being on Fox every day, getting to share my viewpoint. I get to see my son, my daughter, my husband all the time, a lot more. So I would just have to prayerfully consider it and see where God leads me and go in that direction.
Speaking of which, then, one of the other questions was, how do you balance a high-profile career with family?
Yes, it is certainly a balancing act, as any working parent and certainly working mom out there knows. I oftentimes have moments like this where my son's birth certificate somehow made it on the trip in my binder, because you're trying to do your notes, have your birth certificate available if you need it at the airport. He didn't come with me on this trip, but his birth certificate did. I've had many such moments. I know Don Lemon got in trouble for saying mommy brain, but I think that's a real thing. I showed up at work one day on Outnumbered, and I look at my purse, and there's a baby monitor, so that would not have gone 45 minutes back to my house, but it made it to work with me. There's been a lot of moments like that, but I say the biggest thing that has made being a working mom easy is having a community that from the get-go just embraced the idea of being a working mom. When I was on the Trump campaign, I had my first daughter, and I remember being on a flight back from, I think we were coming back from Iowa. It was a campaign chartered plane. I remember Don Jr. holding my daughter, Laura Trump trying to give her a pacifier, and one of the big heads of the RNC, who happens to be a partial owner of the Cubs, walking her up and down the aisle to try to keep her from crying, while my mom was next to me, helping me to set up makeshift baby cribs in hotel rooms. So having a community makes it really easy. But what a joy. I'm not the type that likes to leave my child at home. I'm like, why not? Let's bring a newborn to Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina, which is what we did. And Blake has some pretty fun pictures to look back on.
You have a place in New York as well?
Yes, I'm a Floridian, but yes, and unfortunately, I love my job, but it does bring me to New York.
Yeah, awesome. What part of your upbringing do you think most impacted you and benefited your career, especially in your public speaking role?
Yes, well, no doubt, as I covered initially, faith was the biggest thing. But I think my upbringing, one of the things that helped me in my public speaking role is my dad. My faith views were informed by my church, but my political worldview, and my dad used to always say, "What's your worldview?" Well, I knew that from a faith perspective, I was a Christian, but my political worldview was definitely informed riding in my dad's truck, listening to Rush Limbaugh growing up. He said a lot of things that I just recognized passion and boldness and truth. And listening to him communicate, I think, was probably better preparation than anything I learned at Oxford. But that one attribute helped a lot in public speaking.
You were a spectacular press secretary.
Thank
really.
you.
Kayleigh said when we went back for the quick break, what an engaged audience you are, and that she speaks to groups around the country and seldom has this kind of engagement. And I honestly think it's because we in the Pacific Northwest feel so underrepresented, feel so isolated. That when we finally have somebody here of national stature who's able to articulate the way she is, we feel validated. We feel, yeah. Shall we run her for president right now?
If I could just say, I really, really mean that. You're so engaging, all of you, and I can empathize with you because, granted, I'm a Floridian, so it's a different political landscape. I know how you feel. I've been on the college campuses that are very, very liberal. I've been on those panels where you're shouted down on CNN. And you guys, every day of your life is a CNN panel if you are expressing Christian conservative views. So I mean it. You guys are the real warriors out there on the front lines, spreading the message of Christ. So great work.
So someone wanted to know what it's like being on Air Force One.
The coolest experience, hands down. To give you an idea, just a little story, it tells you a little about my former boss too. So you go on Marine One, if you're lucky, you get to go on Marine One. It's like 6 to 8 people on this helicopter, and you go on, and it's on the front lawn of the White House, and you go by the press, and their cameras are flashing, and you get on this helicopter, Marine One, you take off, you go to Joint Base Andrews, and there's Air Force One, so you land right there on the tarmac. Go on Air Force One, where you have the most incredible meals you could imagine. The chefs are awesome. Just chatting with the President of the United States about policy on Air Force One, it's unreal. But I remember one time I get on Marine One, we're taking off, the blades of grass are like blowing backwards, and it's a Saturday night, and we're taking off to get on Air Force One to go to a rally. And I remember the president looking at me and saying, "Why are you here?" I'm like, oh gosh, like this is the guy who fires people on The Apprentice. This isn't good. So I said, "Sir, I'm your press secretary." He's like, "Oh, I know that. But, I meant, why are you here? It's Saturday night. You could have sent someone else from your staff. What's your husband doing? What's your daughter doing?" And I said, "Well, my husband's a Major League Baseball player, and he might be pitching tonight." And he said, "Your husband might be pitching tonight, and you're here with me." And he turned around to everyone in Marine One and goes, "The Trump show, the greatest show on earth," because we were going to a political rally. But the whole night, from Marine One to Air Force One, he was asking me, "Is your husband pitching? Is he up yet?" And I said, "No, he's not up yet." I thought he'd forget about it during the rally. He had a lot of other things on his mind. We get back on Air Force One. He asked me again, "Is he pitching?" "No, Mr. President, he's not." We go back on Marine One, get to the White House, and as we're landing, he says, "Kayleigh, go to my private dining room, put your feet up on the table, and watch your husband pitch. Turn on my TV," which I did not take him up on, but it meant a lot that he offered that. And then he said, "And Kayleigh, remember, in the future, send the young kids on the trip. Go be with your husband, go be with your daughter. There's nothing more important than that," which meant a lot to me.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Is your husband at spring training right now?
No, he retired about 1.5 years ago. So he's doing a lot of stay-at-home dad duties, which he gives mixed reviews about.
That's right. Yeah. Does he do diapers?
Yes, he has to. He better be doing diapers today, because he's the only one there.
Here's the next one. You were amazing as responding to reporters' questions. How did you organize yourself and the notebook you had on the podium?
Yeah, so it was interesting. A lot of press secretaries, I would say most of them, rely on the binder being given to them by their team. And I certainly had a team. They were unbelievable, these young kids, and most of them were young. And they would give me a first draft of the binder, and most press secretaries would then study the binder and go about their duties. But I am someone who I love research. I really enjoy public policy and the issues. And so I would get the binder, and I would spend my own time researching each tab. As I mentioned, call department heads. Sometimes I'd say, where's your graph? Like, I wanted to look at the graphs produced by some of the people over in Health and Human Services and CDC, and I would input all the additional facts myself into the binder, so much so that one of the most brilliant women I've ever met, her name's Julia Hahn, she would fight with me. "We've got to take out these pages. You're going to have a 300-page binder." And she would silently eliminate pages and really help me organize. But I think that's what made the job so fun to me. And also, if you liked the way I presented information, it was because I loved learning the information and gathering the information myself and researching myself. And I think that level of preparation made you well equipped to answer questions from a place of knowledge than just speculation.
We loved at the time you told Jim Acosta, "Here are the questions you should be asking."
There were a lot. Long list.
So this is a related question. How much prep time does it take typically for a White House briefing?
Hours. If I had my way, days. That's why we would do briefings every few days, because I would use the days in between to really gather as much information as I could. There was never enough preparation. So I would say many hours and days went into each briefing.
What is the hardest question you ever remember getting?
They didn't really ask many hard questions. I don't think. Might have looked like they did, but no, they didn't. I think There were some reporters, it's not a particular question that I remember, but I will say they're different. I remember Jen Psaki, the first day of her briefing, she was asked, how's Biden liking the Oval Office? I never got that one. That would have been a great one to get. How's the White House dog, I think was another question she got. You could go look these up. I never got those. The questions were a teeny bit harder. But the really hard questions, and look, there are some good reporters in the White House press corps who really take their job seriously. I remember one veteran journalist, I won't say his name because I don't know if he'd want me to share it, but he said to me, he looked at me and he goes, this is not the way journalism used to be. And he was a reporter whose name you wouldn't know, who's fair, balanced in his reporting, and there are a few of them out there, and the hardest questions were always the ones from the very serious reporters who had drilled down on a really tough issue, like a foreign policy issue that was so nuanced, and I'd pray it's somewhere in my binder. But those questions were really tough on something very nuanced, very specific, and it was always the good reporters who had taken the time to research that would ask them.
In your time in the White House, was there something that President Trump did that he doesn't get adequate recognition for?
Yeah, that's a great question that he doesn't get recognition for. Well, a lot. I mean, half the country recognizes what he did. That he doesn't get recognition for. I think the kind of person he is. If you've watched CNN all day, you think he is this like roving, fire-breathing dragon that goes around and shoots out fire to eviscerate anyone in his presence he doesn't like. No. Is he tough? Certainly. There were times I saw him be tough, and it was tough for a purpose, tough for a reason, tough when I wasn't sitting in on the call, but I talked to others who had, tough with the leader of the Taliban. So much so that not another American died during the period, I believe it was after that phone call until he left office. So he was tough, but he also has a very gentle, nice, kind side, very affable. You always left a meeting laughing. If he just very, very fun to be around. So I would say he doesn't get credit for the person he is. Just look how his family turned out, how his kids turned out, how wonderful they are. So the kind of father he is and the kind of person he is and how he treats his staff. He's not always the guy in The Apprentice. There's more to him than that.
Do you and Jim Acosta have any kind of contact with each other?
No. Jim, he was interesting. I always like to do there's a tactic I used with him where I'd try to kind of put him on his heels. I would say, Jim, I love your tie today. That's a very nice suit jacket or something. It kind of put him on defense a little bit, or kind of took away his guard, I should say. But no, he would be generally nice when we would see each other, but then there'd be times where he'd like try to call and yell at me. So he wasn't someone that you're just like chummy with on the sidelines. It just, that didn't happen. Yeah.
If you had opportunity to speak to the Christians all over the nation, what's the one thing you would ask them to do that you think would make a difference in the country?
This is appropriately named APOLOGIA. Apologia meaning to give a formal defense for what you believe. It's the root word for apologetics, and I love apologetics. This is essentially, you can read these amazing academics, scientists even. One is Francis Collins, who people don't like. Some of the things he decided on COVID-19, I understand. But he worked in the Trump administration, and he's written this entire book about why the intricacy of the human body and why science points to God. In apologetics, you see the practice of philosophy and science and all of these human-created endeavors as defenses for why we believe what we believe. Of course, Scripture is where we find truth, but I don't think that means we have to put our mind aside. We can use science and use these human disciplines to see God through them, and something that I've gotten a great appreciation for. But my point in sharing that with you is apologia means giving a formal defense for what you believe. And we are not just, it's not just suggestive that we do that. In fact, it's commanded. I believe it's 1 Peter 3:5 to always give a reason for the hope that you have. But the second part's really important, but do so with gentleness and respect. I think as Christians, we have to be bold. We have to say what we believe and why we believe it and not hide from what is truth. And we need to share the truth, not our truth, the truth with others with gentleness and respect, where they see through our words and our actions, they see Christ in us. So Christians across the country, be bold, share the truth, and do it with kindness, and it would make a big difference.
I don't quite know how to even ask you this question, but what are your thoughts when the current press secretary just looks into the camera and tells us things like the border is absolutely secure?
It doesn't take a rocket scientist to determine that's not true. You know, it's a tough job, I will say. No doubt about it. It's a tough job. It's a hard job. And, you know, everyone has their thoughts on the current press secretary or the press secretary before. But one of the things I will say where I truly and genuinely felt bad for the current press secretary is what you bring forward and what you say at the podium is only as good as your information. So, for instance, on this document scandal with Biden, she was told the investigation had wrapped up. And I don't believe that she knew otherwise. And she said that, and then they found another tranche of documents, and people called her a liar. You know, I don't do that because I think I recognize how hard that job was. I don't believe that she told a lie in that instance. I believe she was given bad information and shared what was bad information with the American people. That's one of the things that's very challenging about the job. So let's say a meeting explodes into the headlines of the New York Times. You go to one person in that meeting, and they say this happened, and you go to another person in the meeting and they say this happened, and it's a meeting you weren't in, what do you say? What do you share? So in a way, being a press secretary, you have to be a little bit of an investigator and investigate things and find what is truthful to share with the American public. It's a hard part of the job, an important part of the job, but saying things like the border is secure and not open, I mean, you just turn on Fox and watch Bill Maloogian. That's just simply not true.
Yeah. How were you feeling when Joe Biden became president? What was going on emotionally for you? Because you'd already been pushing hard in the current administration at that point, and we're just curious what you were feeling and what you thought.
Yeah, I think the hardest part is knowing that the good work that we had done was coming to a close. You know, by God's grace, Amy Coney Barrett is on the court, and the decisions have been different, and Dobbs overturned Roe, and we went through all the religious liberty decisions, but knowing that all of these federal judges appointed, thankfully they have life appointments, but knowing that good work was coming really to a close, and there would be an entirely new president with a new set of policies that we knew would devastate the nation, and that's what we've seen. This was predictable, seeing the porous southern border, crime in the streets of our country, the division that we all feel and see, the economy, the invasion of Ukraine. I don't think that would have happened. I know it wouldn't have happened under my former boss because it didn't happen. And Russia had an invasion under Obama, and then there was one under Biden, but there was a big gap in between. China empowered more than ever before. President Trump took so many great actions on China, tough actions, and all of it just undone. And to watch what was so good just silently or very overtly unravel, whether it's the economy with inflation to foreign policy, you just knew what was on the horizon, and unfortunately we're seeing it transpire every day.
Yeah. I think it's been a wake-up call to all of us. You just touched on it briefly, but do you want to talk more about what you think about U.S. relationships with China?
Yeah, what's so important with that is to take a whole-of-government approach. So there's actually a document out there. I believe it was at the end of the Trump administration that it was put out. But basically, the document illustrates everything that was done by all of Trump's government against China. And there's something like 47 actions that were taken across all these different departments. So it was a whole-of-government approach where every department across the U.S. government was taking actions against China, be it tariffs or sending warning shots to China. China knew unmistakably, we're not going to mess with President Trump, and they didn't, not in the same way it's happening now. Now you have China, who's looked over at Russia invading Ukraine, and I believe really battling with the calculus of, should we take Taiwan? We have a president that allows foreign dictators to redraw the map. And that is what we've seen with Russia, with Vladimir Putin. President Trump, I think, said it yesterday at CPAC. Putin wouldn't have done that on my watch. She might take Taiwan on Biden's watch. We certainly hope not. But the whole of government approach, make no mistake, China understood toughness through tariffs. China understood when President got on the phone with Xi, there was no taking Taiwan on his watch. So what we've seen is, unfortunately, instead of peace through strength, as President would say, we've seen violence through weakness. I don't think what we're seeing on the world stage is just unmitigated, senseless violence because we don't have a strong commander-in-chief. And I would just say, if I could, not to mention Afghanistan, which was one of the worst things that has happened on the world stage. Certainly, I would say in the last decade, no doubt about it. 13 Americans who were killed. We sent our men and women overseas and fought this endless war for 2 decades. And just like that, the Taliban reverses 20 years of hard work because we had a president who wanted to get out by September 11th so he could have this moment where he got out of this endless war rather than doing it methodically as President Trump would have done. And it's no coincidence that China started circling jets around Taiwan and Putin invaded Russia after what they saw in Afghanistan. They saw a country, I went to bed one Friday night and I woke up Monday to the United Emirates of Afghanistan, a newly declared Taliban safe haven. And that happened because of the weakness from our commander-in-chief. But the one thing I will say, as troubling as it can be to talk about these events and can feel like chaos, in the book I mentioned that's coming out, Serenity in the Storm, Christ is working even through chaos and disaster. And one of the most amazing things I got to do in this book is talk to a member of the underground church in Afghanistan. So when everyone left Afghanistan, she chose to stay. And I got on a Zoom call with this woman. I have to call her by a different name because of the risk to her life, but her name's Asman, as I call her in the book. And I saw such joy and hope and happiness in her eyes. And she said it's an honor to stay in Afghanistan, an honor. And it's a good time for Christians, she said, despite the fact that many of her Christian brethren and sisters have lost their lives at the hands of the Taliban. But she says it's a good time because she said that the men and women in Afghanistan, some Taliban members even, recognize when they saw the U.S. soldiers, they saw Christianity, she said. They put the two together, and they saw the good work of the U.S. soldiers, and they see it as Christianity, and then they see the evils being committed by the Taliban. This woman is incredible. She radiated with such joy, and she said that despite being small, the underground church in Afghanistan is alive and well and on fire. And she said, in America and in the West, you go out and you see Christians in the street and you go to a prayer group and you take it for granted. But she said, for us, there's nothing as special as seeing a Christian in the midst of the Taliban ridden in Afghanistan and making eye contact and getting to exchange a smile. She said what joy it brings to her life when she gets to have such a simple moment. But the church is on fire in Afghanistan, despite being small, in Iran. So where we've seen this oppression from human government, we see Christianity growing in spades and people who are receptive to it because of that. So God is at work even amid the chaos.
Yeah. You are in New York most of the time, but does that give you any opportunity to put your finger on the pulse of the American church? Do you have any sense of what's happening in the American church?
I think, there's a real a need and a yearning for God. I've seen that at the churches I go to. They're packed, and I say churches because we go to Mass with my husband. Every seat in the Catholic Church is full. And then I go to my non-denominational church. It's like a Southern Baptist church, but maybe between that and Pentecostal, it's somewhere in there. Yes, and the pastor speaks with such boldness, and it's so important. It's not the position of a pastor to say, vote for this candidate or that candidate, but where it is indispensably important is for the church to be involved in politics. Yes. So I'll get back to this New York church in a moment, but in 2016, my home church in Florida, Southern Baptist Church, I remember my pastor giving a sermon, and he didn't name candidates or say vote Hillary or vote Trump, he didn't do that, but he gave the principles of Christian voting, and it was unmistakable, the only conclusion you could come to walking away from the church, because one of the principles was as a Christian, you cannot vote for a candidate that is pro-choice. You cannot. Incompatible. You cannot. I mean, the Bible, it's amazing how it speaks to so many issues we're dealing with now, but especially, I would say it speaks most clearly to the issue of life. You know, before you were formed in your mother's womb, I knew you before. And many other verses, you are worth more than many sparrows. The Bible's unmistakable where you should stand on this issue. But, you know, you'd expect to hear kind of this kind of sermon maybe in a big church in Florida, but this church in New York that I attend, he speaks to these issues very clearly on the issue of life, on the issue of wokeness and Disney and the decisions that they've made that are indoctrinating our children. It's not the entirety of his sermon, but it's part of it. And that church is growing, and it's on fire, and it's diverse, and it's beautiful. So the church, it's not just should engage in politics, but must. As they say, politics are downstream from culture, and we're having a cultural reckoning. And to be a church that doesn't speak to these issues, it's doing untold damage, especially to our young people. So it's such a pleasure to see what Westgate Chapel is doing. You're making a huge, huge difference.
Thank you. Thank you. Have you heard about what happened 3 weeks ago at Asbury Seminary?
Yes, beautiful.
Is there any chatter? I know that Tucker called. I thought it was kind of amazing. Tucker apparently called and asked if he could bring a crew, and they waved him off. Just because they didn't feel like they wanted it publicized. But it seems to be spreading to campuses in different places in the nation. So it seems that God's on the move.
He is on the move. In fact, Fox and Friends' Ainsley Earhart went to the Asbury Revival and saw beautiful stories of transformation, and it is on the move. I've read about, where was it? There was another state that a similar revival was happening, but that's exactly what we need right now. You went through the way that revival changed Europe, and it seems like we're on the precipice of that, and gosh, do we need to pray every day that it doesn't just take hold in Asbury, but across the nation to transform hearts and minds for Christ.
Yeah, that's the key. Yeah. How close were we legitimately to packing the court? Was that ever, do you think, a legitimate endeavor?
I do. I do think it was. You know, there was the court packing commission or whatever. That, you know, they came out with some wishy-washy conclusion. I forget exactly. You know, Biden, I think he probably made a political calculus in his mind. Is this something that I can do and not have backlash? He probably determined the answer to that is no. But we've seen before institutions change. The filibuster's still there in the Senate, for example, but it was removed for Supreme Court nominees, the nuclear option, I should say. So I don't think that there's any hesitancy on the part of the left. That was Harry Reid that did that, to change institutions and remake institutions, but he probably calculated that the backlash would just be too vast for that one.
Yeah. And then creating a state out of Washington, D.C.?
He's a big believer in that, except when he wants to strike down the state he wants to create, as he did this past week that we talked about on crime. And boy, would that change politics if you made D.C. a state. D.C. wasn't designed to be a state. It was designed to be for all of us as the seat of our nation's capital. But the left, they have other designs for D.C. for electoral reasons.
Do you have hopes for what Congress is trying to do, some of the investigations? Do you think with the slim majority that they have, that there's a hope we'll see action out of them, that the president won't just turn around and veto?
I do. You know, I had the pleasure of interviewing Jim Jordan and Steve Scalise, and Jim Jordan, he is on fire to make change. He wants to bring sunlight to a lot of these issues, and there's so many. You know, everyone likes to talk about Hunter Biden, but you know, to me, and that's important, of course, to look at. But I mentioned Afghanistan. You know, I want to get to the bottom of what happened in Afghanistan, because you had generals who were telling the president, don't do this, and he chose to do it. And there needs to be oversight there. There needs to be oversight on our southern border, and this is one of the things in the Republican Party that I think we should speak about the border differently. There's a lot of incredible, hardworking men and women that just want a better shot for their children. There's also, of course, as we've seen, MS-13 and drugs and cartels that are pouring across our border. So we must have a secure border. But what I mean by talk about it differently, the left likes to say they're so humane and so caring and have such a bleeding heart for the individuals crossing our border, except when it happens in their administration. So there have been some reports that have come out, and these were especially in the early days of the Biden administration, young girls, illegal immigrant young girls who were brought over by the cartel, presumably many of them, put in U.S. facilities where some of these girls had to use plastic bags for the bathroom because there was nowhere for them to use the restroom. This is what is humane in the left's view when it comes to illegal immigration. Putting them in these facilities, they were fed chicken that was bloody and raw with feathers coming out of it. And at one facility with these teenage children, they had to confiscate N95 respirators because they were taking the metal portions of the mask and trying to engage in self-harm and take their own lives. These are all reported. ABC, NBC did some reports on it, but it basically ended there. I have a heart for those young children that have been sent across our border, pawns in a scheme, put in these government facilities, and I've yet to see Kamala Harris go to one. I've yet to see Joe Biden go to one of them. I've yet to see them highlight the plight of these young children. So I hope the GOP, when we investigate the border, important to investigate that aspect too, because it is the antithesis of humanitarian to incentivize people to cross the border in the hands of the cartel and then put them in facilities where they're put in these deplorable conditions, and we just don't talk about it because it's happening on the left's watch. So I am very hopeful on the border, Afghanistan, that we'll get a lot of those answers.
Do you think beyond holding investigations, they actually can enact laws that will bring security to the border, or is that a lost cause until 2024?
Lost cause until 2024. I don't foresee Chuck Schumer building a wall anytime soon, even though it helped to secure the border. But no, I don't have much hope for bipartisan immigration reform. The left has decided, despite supporting barriers on the southern border, which they did many, many, many times before Trump came on board, that now it's something that they just will not do.
Yeah, they seem to have flip-flopped on a lot of those issues that were. Well, Kayleigh, thank you. We'll be praying for you, for God to refresh you.
Could I say one thing? Just
Yes,
because I really wanted to get this in there, and there was not a place for it, because it happened today, because we talk about a Christian revival, and I should have brought this up there. I was very encouraged. I'm not a fan of Mayor Eric Adams of New York City. Most of you probably know him. He did say this, though, and I think it's important to give credit where credit's due. I was shocked when I watched this. I was like, is this doctored video? He said, "We are destroying our next generation. Don't tell me about separation of church and state. The state is the body, the church is the heart. You take the heart out of the body, and the body dies. I cannot separate my belief because I'm an elected official. When I walk with God. When I talk with God. When I put policies in place, I put them in with God." Hopefully that means he's changing his abortion views. But I like this approach, and we must have. He talked about prayer in schools and how when we started to see guns go into schools was the moment when prayer came out. So maybe that revival is happening, and maybe it's starting right there in the mayor's office in New York City. So let's keep praying for that.
Wow.
Sorry to interrupt.
Do you have any other goodies in that folder of yours you want to
I have a lot of them, but I'm saving them for Jim Acosta round 2, maybe. Just kidding.
Thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you, Kayleigh. We're just so honored that you'd come all this way. And we pray God refresh you on the flight home, and we'll be watching you on Outnumbered tomorrow morning.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Amen. God bless you. God bless you, everybody. Good night.